Hello and welcome to The Search. I'm Shahid Jurgen. In this lesson, we're going to examine Psalms 46 and 47, and the title of our study is For Israel and Beyond. For Israel and Beyond. Now, Book 2 of the Psalter opens with tragedy. First, we find a Levite who is separated from Jerusalem, and he's unable to return to the holy city to worship God in Psalms 42 and 43. Second, Israel's army has suffered a devastating defeat in Psalm 44. The king, the people, and the author of this psalm are certain that the nation is about to be entirely destroyed and the people likely sold into slavery. Now, these psalms ring with the notes of exile, even though they probably weren't written during the period of the Babylonian captivity. These laments represent the failures of the kings to properly protect what God had entrusted to them. Psalm 45, however, is a turning point. Psalm 45 is a wedding song, likely performed when the king took a new bride. It celebrates and praises the king and queen on their wedding day and looks forward to the royal children which will be born to their union with hopeful optimism. Psalm 45 means that God is not done with the line of David in spite of the Davidic dynasty's many failures. Now, this renewed optimism, which begins in Psalm 45, continues into Psalms 46 and 47, where we're going to see the work of God for Israel and the nations being proclaimed. Psalm 46 is a hymn of trust in the God of refuge, who serves as Israel's fortress and strength. Psalm 47 is a praise song, which invites Israel and the nations to celebrate God's sovereign universal rule. Combined, these psalms present the testimony of the sons of Korah concerning God's work on behalf of his people and the Gentiles. Now, as noted just a moment ago, Psalm 46 is a hymn of trust in God. It divides pretty neatly into three sections, which Craig outlines in this way. First, we find God's refuge in the context of natural phenomena. Second, God's refuge in the context of the nations of the world. And finally, God's refuge in the context of both natural and national powers. And each of these sections is marked off by the use of this mysterious word we've noted before, Selah, which may indicate a breath or a pause for some kind of musical interlude during the recitation of this particular psalm. All right, Psalm 46 for the director of music of the sons of Korah, according to Alamoth, a song, verse 1. God is our refuge and strength, an ever-present help in trouble. Therefore, we will not fear, though the earth give way and the mountains fall into the heart of the sea, though its waters roar and foam and the mountains quake with their surging. Now, in verse 1, we are introduced to the main character of this psalm, and some of his personality traits are celebrated. Psalm 46 is about God, who is described as a strong refuge and abiding help for those who are facing trouble. This, of course, was a message that Israel desperately needed as they reflect back on those times of defeat and despair, and even as they faced the looming threat of exile. The only safety Israel ever experienced was when they were being fortified by God. In verses 2 and 3, we find the imagery of this natural cataclysm, sort of used to depict a world just falling apart. Even in the face of decreation, where God's ordered world unravels, the psalmist professes a radical trust in the Creator. God alone has the power to preserve his people through such catastrophe. Picking up in verse 4, there is a river whose streams make glad the city of God, the holy place where the Most High dwells. God is within her, she will not fall. God will help her at break of day. Nations are in uproar, kingdoms fall. He lifts his voice, the earth melts. Yahweh Almighty is with us. The God of Jacob is our fortress. Now, one of the mysteries about Psalm 46 is this river mentioned in verse 4. The city of God, where the sanctuary is located, of course, must be Jerusalem, Yahweh's dwelling place. However, as far as we know, there's no river running through or out of Jerusalem. So this is meant to invoke some kind of imagery. Perhaps the imagery is just of a calm and peaceful river that in this verse is meant to contrast the roaring chaos water that we saw in the act of decreation just a moment ago in the previous section. It could also be that the point is to connect Jerusalem with Eden. We remember that Eden had four flowing rivers that emerged from it to water the earth. Or it could just be that this life-giving water, which ancient people would associate with rivers, is depicted as flowing from the presence of God to give life. God is the source of life, and that life pours out and covers the earth, beginning at the point of Jerusalem where God dwells. Now, Jerusalem is God's city, and the psalmist believes that as long as God dwells therein, nothing can oppose her. No matter how violently the nations rage, his presence and his command will cause those enemies, even the earth if he so desires, to fade into nothingness. This reminds us of Psalm 2, when God laughs at the plotting of the nations who have banded together in order that they might rebel against him. Now, verse 7 marks the end of this section, but also introduces a kind of refrain, which we're going to see repeated at the end of the psalm. Yahweh Almighty is with us. The God of Jacob is our fortress. Now, there's some difficulty in how to translate this expression. The traditional formula that you probably heard is the Lord of hosts, or Yahweh of hosts, as we see in the King James Version, the English Standard Version, and others. But we might ask, well, what are hosts? The New American Standard, the 2020 edition, tries to clarify things. It says the Lord or Yahweh of armies. So armies instead of hosts. And the NLT tries to clarify even further, the Lord or Yahweh of heaven's armies. Now, the point seems to be that not only is God personally present in Jerusalem, but he also brings with him a vast heavenly army. In that way, he is the Lord or Yahweh of hosts. You might recall that Elisha on one occasion was trapped behind enemy lines, behind the army of the Arameans, and he asked Yahweh to open the eyes of his fearful servant. Then Yahweh opened the servant's eyes, and he looked and saw the hills full of horses and chariots of fire all around Elisha. That's 2 Kings 6 and verse 17. So these are the hosts, the heavenly armies that Yahweh leads into battle. And in this case, he's coming to lead that army into battle to safeguard Jerusalem and to defeat his enemies. Moving on now into the last section, beginning in verse 8. Come and see what Yahweh has done, the desolations he has brought on the earth. He makes wars cease to the ends of the earth. He breaks the bow and shatters the spear. He burns the shields with fire. He says, be still and know that I am God. I will be exalted among the nations. I will be exalted in the earth. Yahweh Almighty is with us. The God of Jacob is our fortress. Now, Kinder writes, although the outcome is peace, the process is judgment. God's destructive power will be used to break weapons of war and to end the violence that has so marred human history. In verse 10, the triumphant warrior God speaks. He says, be still and know that I'm God. I will be exalted among the nations. I'll be exalted in the earth. Of course, it was the nations who brought disorder to the earth. But at the intervention of God, both the rebellious humans and the land itself will pour out their praise for God. And then in verse 11, we echo that earlier refrain that God comes to earth, leading his mighty host to become the protector of his people, Israel. Now, we'll have more to say about the message of this psalm in a little while, but for now, we're going to go right into Psalm 47. At the end, we'll sort of analyze these two psalms together. Now, Psalm 47 is a praise song, and it's structured around two calls for the audience to join the author in praise. The first is found in verse 1, clap your hands, all you nations, shout to God with cries of joy. And then a second call is added in verse 6, sing praises to God, sing praises to our King, sing praises. Each of these summons to praise is then followed by reasons for why God is worthy of such acclaim. Psalm 47, for the director of music of the sons of Korah, a psalm. Verse 1, clap your hands, all you nations. Shout to God with cries of joy. For Yahweh Most High is awesome, the great King over all the earth. He subdued nations under us, peoples under our feet. He chose our inheritance for us, the pride of Jacob, whom he loved. God has ascended amid shouts of joy, Yahweh amid the sounding of trumpets. Now, while Psalm 46, our previous psalm, focuses primarily on Israel's relationship with God, Psalm 47 is a rare psalm because it invites the Gentiles to worship Yahweh. We see this in the expressions peoples, nations, and all the earth. These establish the worldwide vision of this praise song. Just like with Psalm 46, this psalm testifies that the nations will not come to worship God until they have been subdued. They must bend their will to the authority of God. They must confess Him as the great King over all the earth. While God's conquest is ultimately universal, the psalmist testifies that Israel is His special inheritance. After all, He made a covenant treaty with them. They became His vassal, representing Him to the nations. Israel's conquest of Canaan was actually God's conquest. And the psalmist emphasizes that this work all began because of God's love for Abraham's descendants. Shouts of joy and the sounding of trumpets mark God's ascension. Now, what is this ascension? Well, it could be God going up to Jerusalem to take His place in the temple, or perhaps it is His ascension over the nations in becoming their king. Either way, the elevation of God is to be celebrated, and that segues into the next call for praise, which begins in verse 6. Sing praises to God, sing praises. Sing praises to our King, sing praises. For God is the King of all the earth. Sing to Him a psalm of praise. God reigns over the nations. God is seated on His holy throne. The nobles of the nations assemble as the people of the God of Abraham, for the kings of the earth belong to God. He is greatly exalted. Now, this is a remarkable stanza. The call to praise in verse 6 utilizes repetition for emphasis, and it's followed by a reason for that praise, just as the first call was followed by a reason. In verse 2, it's for God is the King of all the earth. And that is repeated here. For Yahweh Most High is awesome, the great King over all the earth. Now, Psalm 47 is thus not merely a call to praise. It's also an enthronement psalm. It's designed to declare that God has taken His throne as ruler of all the earth. And since God is king over all, both Israel, who are God's covenant partners, and the Gentile nations are summoned to His palace, where they can join together in praising His reign. Now notice verse 8. The nobles of the nations assemble as the people of the God of Abraham, or as the NLT renders it, the rulers of the world have gathered together with the people of the God of Abraham. According to Deuteronomy 32, verses 8 and 9, God disinherited the nations, and He chose Israel as His portion, His inheritance. This reference in Deuteronomy 32, verses 8 and 9, probably correlates to the events of the Tower of Babel and the subsequent election of Abraham. Now, Psalm 47 certainly maintains Israel's special covenantal position, but it amends the message of Deuteronomy 32 as if to say, yes, God chose Israel, but He's not done with the nations. He has not altogether abandoned them. He has a plan with them and for them. And then Psalm 47 anticipates this new creation where the world is remade and God's relationship with the human race is renewed. Wilson writes, God's ultimate purpose according to this important Old Testament thematic strand, is to bring about the restoration of his original creation intention by redeeming the human race and by recreating the harmony and unity with which the cosmos began. Insofar as Psalm 47 anticipates a day when all the peoples of the earth will join with Israel as the people of God to praise Yahweh as king over the whole earth, it is this eschatological consummation of God's purpose that the psalmist holds in mind. We've already seen some other psalms, like Psalm 8, that reflect back on the world as it was when God originally made it. But Psalm 47 takes that one step further in confidently affirming that God will once again rule over all the earth when the new creation is consummated, just as he ruled over all the earth in the beginning, before sin and death came into the world. Now, it's also important for us to remember the context of Psalms 46 and 47 as they fit into this collection of psalms from the sons of Korah. So let's remind ourselves of the story so far, starting with Psalm 42. There, again, we met this temple worker who is unable to return to Jerusalem for a sacred feast. He longs to be home again where he can worship God. And then Psalm 44, Israel suffers this terrible military defeat, and they fear that they're about to be sold into slavery. Again, these psalms emphasize the theme of exile, and they represent the humiliating failures of the Davidic dynasty. However, God's not done with David's line, because in Psalm 45, there's a royal wedding, and that brings renewed hope in the future descendants of David. In fact, while the kings may have failed, Psalm 46 says God himself will act as Israel's strong protector, because the children of Abraham belong to him. Psalm 47 finishes this little section out by saying, not only do Abraham's children belong to God, the whole earth is under his domain. He's the king over all the earth, and the nations will be brought under his authority. Again, it doesn't matter how miserable the Davidic kings or the Israelite nation fail, God will be the one to accomplish his will on the earth. And the story is going to continue into Psalm 48 as well, because there we'll talk about Jerusalem and its importance to God. It's the city of Yahweh Almighty, the city of our God, Psalm 48 and verse 8. And then finally, there's one last psalm in this little sub-collection from the sons of Korah, and that's Psalm 49, another reflection on this conviction that God is king of the earth. Psalm 49 is going to mock those who seek wealth and turn to evil as those who are destined to die with nothing to show for all their worldly gain. But God will redeem me from the realm of the dead. He will surely take me to himself. Verse 15. If God is king over all, then nothing can separate God from his people, even death. Psalms 46 and 47 are pivotal components of this story. They testify concerning God's role as the protector of his people. They call upon the entire human race, Jews and Gentiles alike, to praise and worship the God who rules the universe. God is the king of all the earth. And even though many in his domain are rebelling against his rule, one day God's reign over the nations will be fully realized. And on that day, all those who belong to him will join together to sing to him these psalms of praise. And so we will continue to study this story in these psalms from the sons of Korah in our next lesson. Come back and be with us at that time. Until then, God bless.